Well, good evening, everybody. Councillors, staff, members of the gallery and members of the media. I declare the opening of the meeting of the 17th of August 2021. This is a briefing forum in Council Chambers at the City of Subiaco at 5:31 p.m. On behalf of the City of Subiaco, I acknowledge the Wadja Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the area. We recognise their cultural connection to the land and the waterways of Subiaco and their continuing contribution to our city. Please note this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. By being present at this meeting, members of the public consent to the possibility that their image and voice may be live streamed and recorded. Recordings will be made available on the City's YouTube channel following the meeting. Confidential sections of meetings will not be live streamed or recorded. Okay, item 2. I would like to acknowledge the new CEO who started yesterday, Colin Cameron, who is very much hitting the ground running. He says he's already on top of most of the issues. When you have opportunity to come and meet him. Item number 2 is attendance, apologies and leave of absence. Apologies, are there any apologies? Okay, did Councillor Nash give his actual apologies? He was here a little while ago. Councillor Davis? Okay, so we accept his apologies. Councillor Nash, Davis, Mansfield. Leave of absence from Mayor Penny Taylor and Councillor Blake Phelan. For those of the gallery who don't know me, I'm Stephanie Stroud, the Deputy Mayor, and I'm obviously presiding this evening. Disclosures of interest. We have a disclosure from Councillor Hammersley, a financial interest on C2. Do we have any other disclosures of interest? Yes, thank you. Councillor Jennings.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. I, Lynette Jennings, wish to declare an interest in the following item to be considered by Council at its meeting it's a Agenda briefing forum meeting to be held on 17 August 2021. Agenda item C2 616 Hayes Street, Jolimont Responsible Authority Report. The type of interest I wish to declare is financial pursuant to section 5.60A of the Local Government Act. The nature of my interest is I own shares in Wesfarmers Limited and the development applicant is a wholly owned subsidiary of Wesfarmers Limited. Thanks.
And sorry, Councillor Hammersley, would you like to read out your interest?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I actually have 2. So I'll start with the first is I, Angela Hammersley, wish to declare an interest in the following item to be considered by Council at its meeting to be held on 17 August 2021. Agenda item C2. The type of interest I wish to declare is financial pursuant to section 5.60A of the Local Government Act 1995. The nature of my interest is I hold a parcel of Wesfarmers Limited shares in my self-managed superannuation fund and another parcel in my own name. Wesfarmers Limited is the owner and operator of Bunnings. And the next one is for C3. So I, Angela Hammersley, wish to declare an interest in the following item to be considered by Council at its meeting to be held on 17 August 2021. It's agenda item C3. The type of interest I wish to declare is proximity, pursuant to section 5.60B of the Local Government Act 1995. The nature of my interest is I am the owner of 24 Catherine Street, Subiaco, which is immediately across the road from property that is the subject of the draft local development plan under consideration. Thank you.
Do I have any more disclosures? Okay, thank you. Moving on to agenda item 4, approved deputations. There are none. And moving on to the Chief Executive, will now read the conditions of entry. Thank you. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you to Deputy Mayor Stroud. The conditions of entry and the behaviour to this agenda briefing forum are contained in a statement that is actually displayed on the door on entry to the council chambers. Please ensure that you're familiar with those conditions so that the meeting can be contained in an appropriate standard. Thank you.
Agenda item 5, announcements by the presiding member. There is none. So moving on now to the officer reports. Now I'm aware of a number of people in the gallery who have come to listen to the Responsible Authority report of Hay Street. So I'm happy to move that item forward to, does anybody object to that? Okay, so councillor, we have 2 councillors who will step out of this item. And let's move on to C2, which is all about Bunnings and their new location on 616 Hay Street and their DA. Do I have any questions on this item?
Yes, thank you, and through you, presiding member. How did this proposal fare with the design review panel, and how did it score out of the 10 elements?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, that's discussed on the attachment, page 10 of the Responsible Authority report. So there were a number of iterations that a proposal for the warehouse has been over a couple of years. So in the end result, out of the 10 principles, 7 were supported and 3 were subject to further attention, and this has been addressed through recommended conditions of approval.
Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Yeah, thank you. And on another matter in regard to transport, I noticed that there had been, I think, an independent transport study produced in addition to the one that was produced, I think, by Transcore on behalf of the applicants. Is it possible to get a copy of that alternate report? I note that it is addressed in point form in the RAR, but is it possible to get for elected members to actually have the entire report, please?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, I'm not aware as part of the applicants on if they had a separate transport impact statement. I know there's one prepared by the applicants and reviewed by the city's technical services team. If you can provide more information on the other one, if there was one produced by the applicants. I noted that there may have been one produced on behalf of a neighbouring landowner, being St Ives. However, that does not form part of this application.
Yes, look, thank you. That may be the one. I think it was called Veal, was done by Veal. And that's the report I'm referring to. And apparently it has also been assessed by the city officers, I think.
Do we have any more questions on this item? Thank you, Councillor De Vries.
Yeah, through you, presiding member. This is for the Manager for Planning Services. We talked a little earlier about the traffic calming measures that might be put in place on Bishop Street. I'm just aware that there is going to be an increase in traffic, obviously, to some extent, or this might be for you, sorry. That might require some traffic calming similar to what's in place in Jersey Street. Would the city be providing that sort of traffic calming measures, or would Bunnings be expected to provide that? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. So there are existing traffic calming installed on Bishop Street. Now, as part of the proposed application, the increase in traffic is considered to be within what the road has been built for, so the standard, so it's well within that. However, in doing this, we have recommended condition number 23, which following further safety assessments may require some measures to improve pedestrian safety on the corner of Bishop and Hay Street to coincide with the traffic calming measures, and that would be the responsible by the applicant on advice from the city.
Do I have any more questions? Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Rowe, and then Councillor McMullen.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Presiding Member. Yeah, one of the things I didn't ask in the preview that we just had was the landscaping. I just wanted to know who's doing the landscaping and at what cost to the city, if there is any, both on the laneway and the street sides, please.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member, the landscaping will be undertaken as required by the applicant as they are generating the proposal in accordance with any advice, yes, and on the laneway. So it would be on the city's advice and clearance of that condition at the cost of the applicant and the developer.
Just a follow-up, what's the retail area comparison compared to where they are now? If you don't have the answer tonight, that's fine, but I was just interested to know the retail floor area as compared to where they are now.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member, it's approximately double at this site.
Sorry, Councillor McMullen first. Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Through you, Presiding Member, it's a question in relation to the key planning issues at Table 1. I've got two questions, and the first just relates to the assessment that's showing up in red in my text and in my report, and it relates to plot ratio and street setbacks. There's obvious variation against the planning frameworks in that the plot ratio is a little bit higher than what was prescribed, and so the street setbacks have up to a 2 metre variation. Do we know why it is that that those two factors are the case? I mean, often we get told that it's simply not possible to comply with planning frameworks because projects become unviable or site conditions don't allow it. But why would it be the case on this particular site that we couldn't have just had the appropriate street setbacks all the way around, or we couldn't have had the plot ratio that's provided for in LPS 5? Do we know that? That's my first question.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. So while plot ratio controls are provided in the scheme, each development is different. So in this instance, it went down to the definition that is not in our scheme given the new template, and if we had our previous definition, then the plot ratio would have, the way you calculate it would be consistent, because when you calculate plot ratio area, different definitions include like staircases and stairwells and so forth. So we've had to rely on the ARCO's definition, which is a little bit clunky. In effect, there's no real material difference. With regard to the street setbacks, it relates to a very small area on page 18 on the RAR, and that is as it relates to Bishop Street. So it relates to the sawtooth design of the facade and the roof form, and it's the actual sawtooth, reminiscing of the city's industrial development of the past, which is actually protruding through the street setback line. So there is essentially of minimal effect, and it provides a positive streetscape interaction to break up the bulk and scale of the building on Bishop Street. So it's on page 18 of the RAR. I can find the attachment number for you if you like, but you can see shaded in orange, it's the actual sawtooth design. If you had a blank wall, that would be consistent, but would probably lead to a poorer streetscape outcome.
So it's in the interest of design excellence that we've now got a street setback that's less than the development standard, but results in a better outcome overall. Is that the case?
Through you, presiding member, essential.
There it is. My last question relates to bicycle parking, and I just haven't picked up the answer to this anywhere yet. Why is it that we don't have any Class 1 bike parking spaces? That's bike spaces for employees. It looks like the development standard would call for 84, but we've got none.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. So again, on page 20 of the RAR, there are 32 bicycle spaces, which has been segregated into 16 for employees and 16 for customers, and that's has a condition of planning approval recommended to ensure that those bicycle bays and lockers are provided to the Australian standard. So they are there. We have just provided discretion to reduce the number, which ordinarily would have required 84 for a commercial development of this scale.
Well, just a follow-up question then. It looks like if we'd followed the development standards, we would have had 118 bicycle spaces in total. Due to an exercise in discretion, what we'd be looking at in this particular one is 32 bike spaces. Can you just walk me through why that would be a good use of discretion? Is it the case that Bunnings employees and Bunnings customers aren't likely to ride their bikes to Bunnings? Or are there other transport options servicing the site? I'm just trying to understand how we get from the development standard to what's actually proposed and why that would be a good outcome.
Thank you. So again, it's provided on page 20. So there would be an 84 bay shortfall. Now, in considering the nature of operations for bicycle parking, it's captured under our local planning policy that captures commercial development. Understanding how Bunnings warehouses work and the nature of the goods supplied by customers, it's unlikely that you're going to have a very high number of people riding in there and riding out with an electric lawnmower or whatever it might be. So a lot of bulky goods warehouses cater for car traffic, and in this instance it's all contained inside in the basement levels. So in that regard, given the nature of the use and the customers, we have recommended reducing the amount of bicycle parking. There are some instances where some people might ride their bicycles to gather small things from Bunnings, so we have provided some customer parking, and that's been reduced to 16 bays. We have also had 16 bays retained for staff parking, so it's a bit more likely that the staff members who may not be taking large goods home would be more akin to using the bicycle bays to commute from their place of work. Apart from that, I mean, that discretionary assessment is on page 20 of the Responsible Authority report. I'm just paraphrasing.
Thank you. Councillor Powell, thank you.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. Just to clarify from my previous question, I did find the report. It was on page 73, I think, of the matters for information on the RAR, and it was David Veal Consultants have undertaken a peer review. The question was, can we get a copy of that peer review?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. Yes, so that came out through the public consultation process where St Ives provided a peer review of the TransCore statement and TransCore acting on behalf of the applicant. So we have summarised that peer review, but we can provide it to elected members separately after this meeting.
Thank you very much for that. The other matter regards landscaping, or another matter. It looks from the plans as if there will be tree removal from the site. Do you know how many trees may be removed and what kind they might be?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, I'm just going through the plans to get the exact number. However, I do think that there needs to be some tree removal to allow for the access way on Bishop Street. So this is considered the best access way for the circulation of the site and the surrounding area. So there would need to be, I would say, two trees at least removed there, and they would need to be considered and replaced in an appropriate location. And there would likely be some removed on the entry and exit from Hay Street, again through the landscaping provision and consideration in informing the further detailed landscaping design. The city would expect that these trees be replaced appropriately.
Thank you. And one final question. It's in regard to amenity. And I think the RAR has found that this proposal would not have a serious impact on the amenity of the, especially the St Ives residents. Could you amplify on that a little bit? Why it won't have a deleterious impact on them?
Thank you, and through you again, presiding member. The previous design for Bunnings had a number of traffic movements coming from the laneway, which is on the Bunnings site and owned by them, and that would have had a significant amount of amenity with the adjoining residents. Given the reconfiguration of the access points using Hay Street, which the city and the applicant were able to secure with the state government, this has moved traffic away, so amenity in that sense is considered to be a much improved outcome. In essence, the traffic has redesigned it and has improved it from St Ives' point of view. The rear laneway will be maintained as it has easements access on there as well, and as I understand, the applicant worked with the St Ives representatives on the final landscaping and access design for entry gates. So in that instance, and with the colour palette and landscaping to go there, it will have an undue effect on the amenity of the St Ives residents. In addition to that, a number of the St Ives properties on the southern laneway aren't actually orientated on that southern laneway. They're orientated either to Bishop or Ty Streets with back of house services on there as well. And if you look at the aerial photographs and the existing industrial and commercial uses that used to be on that site, this would lead to an improved outcome.
Thank you, Councillor De Vries.
Through you, presiding member. This is just a bit of clarification because I don't think I quite understood how the easement on the Ty Street at the back, I think is at the back of the build, there's a gateway. I just didn't quite understand if that's an access way for the residents of St Ives and the other with a card, or is it how are they going to access that, and is that a benefit to the community? Just to be clear, thank you.
Thank you, and presiding member, through you, and a good question. There are two garages, well, two main access points for St Ives garages coming off from that laneway or the access way, which is part of the Bunnings site. So that's both on the eastern and western portions. So that will remain open for the residents to be able to use their own garages as per normal. As I understand, as per St Ives' instructions and negotiations with Bunnings, a gate has then been installed after those garages so that it doesn't impede access, so that it doesn't encourage any through traffic to have any amenity impacts for the residents of St Ives. There is also a fire easement in there as well, so through the design development process there will be some gates installed that if there ever was to be an unfortunate incident at St Ives, those gates will be properly fire rated and would allow for safe egress of those residents. So that is all to be maintained as part of the application.
Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Thank you. And this was something that was brought up at the annual electors meeting, and it is concerns about the hazardous materials being stored on the site. What comfort can be given to nearby residents that this won't be a risk to them?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, as legislation improves and building codes and fire and safety measures improve, there are strict national regulations that the applicant and Bunnings would need to abide by in the safe storage of materials. Given it would be a new development, it would be of the contemporary and higher standards that Australia actually has at the onset. There is a lane of separation and solid walls between the residents of St Ives and the building, so that provides additional comfort as well. So there are very strict fire and safety regulations that need to be complied with, and would essentially bring the building up to the safest standard that we have in Australia at the moment. There was a recent fire a few years ago in Inglewood, but that Bunnings, as I understand, was retrofitted from an existing business, and it probably will have complied with the legislation of the day. But for example, that Bunnings wasn't, to my understanding, sprinklered, whereas the new standards would require a new Bunnings to be sprinklered to assist in fire mitigation measures.
Thank you, councillors. Have we finished this item? Okay, we will now move back to item 1, which is number 19 Rawson Street, Subiaco, the demolition of an existing single house and construction of a 2-storey single house. Do I have any questions on this item? No. I'll start off then with a question on C1, if I may. I was interested in the analysis that the current single house made no contribution to the significance of the heritage area. And then later on page 7, it suggests that before demolition, that an archival record would be submitted on the residence. So I wondered, what was that archival record looking for that was significant enough to make an archival record, but not enough to stop the demolition of this single-storey home? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, the submission of an archival record is a standard practice in heritage areas. Now, while the heritage assessment considered that the house did not contribute, it likely has gone through significant changes that it cannot be brought back to a state where it would be of heritage significance to contribute. So an archival record just provides an information in place of that building and what may have transpired. It doesn't necessarily mean it has heritage significance. It's just a copy of it retained for future generations.
Okay, thank you. Do I have any other questions on this item? Okay, then we'll move on to the next item, then C3, which is the draft local development plan for Sedan Street Precinct. We know as councillors there's been a lot of questions behind the scenes on this particular draft LDP plan, but do we have any this evening? Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Jennings.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. It would be through you in a question, I suppose, the Manager of Planning or the Director of Planning and then the Manager. The proposed new laneway off Hay Street, that's got certain setbacks above the podium level presently. So if the laneway was removed entirely and say halfway along, so that it was only, the new part only came from the northern end of lot 2, Sanua's lot, and well, it's actually, there's 2 lots there, aren't there? There's lot 500 and then there's lot 2. So it came down halfway the length of the proposed new part of that laneway, or it was entirely removed. What would staff recommend in terms of the setback above the podium level? Because presently at the widest point where the laneway is, I think there's about a 6-metre laneway. There might be a bit of a pedestrian footpath, and then I think above the podium levels of both buildings, if there was development on the Doric lot and the 2 Sanua lots, they would be set back 6 metres. So I think that's about 18 metres. So if the laneway was removed and there was no separation at ground level, what would be the outcome, or what would be the desirable outcome for the setbacks above the podium level? Thanks.
Thank you, and through your presiding member, on initial thought that hasn't really been contemplated because the movement network as proposed needs to work in a calm pedestrian sense. So we have never considered having a cul-de-sac for that new road to not connect it to Hay Street. It very simply would likely not work. The setbacks, going back to your question, the setbacks, we would likely need to revisit those and to understand how the development would interface with the development on the 420 Hay Street site, because you would expect to have some separation between at least different types of development, if one is to be commercial and one is to be residential. So the setbacks may very well be the same as what they are proposed now. However, we haven't considered that in great detail. Should the road and laneway not be proposed, it just have to be reworked. But I would say that it's probably going to be similar to what they are proposed now.
Thank you. Do I have any more questions on this item? Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, presiding member. In the agenda focus area for the built environment, built form with a heritage value is recognised and celebrated and protected. And yet part of that would be demolished, I think, under the plan. Could you comment on that, especially in light of the Griffey's architect's conclusion that partial demolition of the shops would have a moderate impact on the heritage area?
Thank you, and through presiding member, when considering a precinct planning document, an LDP, all planning matters need to be considered holistically. So one of those is heritage, obviously, and the other one is transport and access. So while heritage is proposed to be retained and protected to the greatest extent, in considering the proposal holistically and the future development of this area in the next 20, 40, 50, 80 years, it's considered that the new laneway connecting up to Hay Street would have significant benefits to the Rockaby Road area and the Hay Street area with regard to pedestrian and vehicular access and safety. So we have introduced provisions which look to have as to minimise any demolition of heritage fabric, or to minimise it as possible, and understanding that in any event the row of shops at 424 to 428 Hay Street will be subject to further investigations by structural engineers in the near future, and subject to those results may be retained or may not be able to be retained. So in creating a plan for the future users of the site, for the future residents, businesses and the existing ones in Rockaby Road and Hay Street, we recommend that putting the road through, while you'll have a small impact to the heritage of one of the row of 7 shops, it provides a substantial benefit to the wider precinct and community, and the existing functionality of the Rockaby Road and Hay Street area in the long term.
So in essence, does that mean that it's a bit of a balancing act? It's heritage versus transport access, and the way the plan comes down at the moment, it would be supporting transport access over heritage.
Thank you, and through presiding member, the plan looks at heritage of the whole area, so we would still be retaining large portions of heritage and the remaining buildings for the 440 Hay Street buildings, and setting back from the Catherine Street state heritage listed buildings as well. So while in considering the demolition of one shop and the retention of everything else, and the benefits that the transport movement network will provide, it's considered in this instance that would be of better benefit than them just retaining that one singular shop. So yes, to answer this, it is a very tough decision to make. We've gone through this numerous times with our traffic engineers, our heritage consultants, and the team internally. And it's about getting the best outcome for the area, and this is why the recommendation is as it is.
Thank you very much for that. Just on the Catherine Street, I think in the architect's report there was also some reference that perhaps Catherine Street might be redeveloped in the future as well. Is that the case? Is that what's being envisaged with this plan, I suppose?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. The eastern side of Catherine Street has been considered for redevelopment. However, it has a 2-storey interface for a 15-metre wide portion as it faces the state heritage and local heritage listed Catherine Street terraces, and with redevelopment potential behind that, and sourcing from the Merchant Lane, which has been created from the One Subiaco development. So there's a 15-metre 2-storey interface going into up to 6 stories, subject to the relevant community benefits.
Sorry, and one final question. Amongst the comments on the plan, there have been some from Sanua, the owner, I think, of those heritage listed buildings. It would appear that they are not very supportive of the idea of Merchant Lane going through to Hay Street. Is it necessary really to have their support to put that forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and through your presiding member, the city is being very brave in preparing a precinct plan for an area very, very important to the future development of Subiaco. It's not uncommon that landowners in areas would not like to give up land, as it obviously affects their commercial viability. So we do not need their approval. It's council's call to make on the local development plan, but it has been prepared to consider a number of matters, and it provides greater development potential than most of those landowners currently have under the activity centre plan. So they won't be losing out of any commercial viability from this. We don't need their approval to do it, and if it comes to a development application, then the city and council will need to put their best foot forward with a contemporary planning framework.
Thank you, Councillor De Vries.
Through you, presiding member. This is just a general sort of observation, I suppose, but given that we are probably moving to a much more public transport-oriented society in 20 to 40 years' time, hopefully fewer cars on the road, are we planning for a future of cars on the road or planning for a future of no cars on the road? Because my concern is that we're planning for something that in 40 years' time just might be quite different. And I'm not trying to be controversial, because obviously cars will still be around, but is there any way that we could be thinking completely out of the box on this and working towards a more pedestrian sort of focused LDP? But I mean, I'm not suggesting we have to have vehicle access, I understand that, but is there any way that we could think out of the box on this?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, we have thought very far into the future for this. So while cars may decrease, it's probably likely that they'll increase in the near future. While they may decrease, that would present some opportunities for roads to be changed and pedestrianised as that goes. This has been prepared in considering the two-way of Robertson Hay Street, but notwithstanding that, we need to provide suitable access ways for infrastructure vehicles and waste vehicles as well. So taking them away and the access ways provided actually take them away from the more pedestrianised areas of Sedan Street. And what I would say there is we spend a lot of time on the intersection of Sedan and Rockaby Road now, and just imagining that at peak with full development there and everyone going up Sedan Street is a bit of a nightmare scenario for cars, people and traffic. So to get a good pedestrian environment, you need to provide alternative routes for service vehicles, cars and other people visiting the area.
Councillor Rowe, then Councillor McMullen. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I know I flagged this some time ago with the current administration, but if we go back some years, the city was very keen on pushing a pedestrianised walkway through a redevelopment on the west side of Katherine, and we achieved that in a design outcome for that particular site, and it linked the cul-de-sac of Sedan, when you think about it being a more pedestrianised area, through to York and the old TO building as it was in the old days. Particularly that 420 Hay and the others are privately owned, and that those access ways may never happen. So I'm just wondering why we wouldn't have flagged a desire to maintain that approach, linking the cul-de-sac end of Sedan through to Katherine as a walkway. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. Great question, easy answer. It's in the LDP to have that, so it's part of a community development for the corner site to link up a pedestrian access and both vehicle and pedestrian access linking Sedan Street to York Street. I'll rephrase that. The pedestrian access is linking Sedan Street to York Street, and the vehicular access is through the access ways. So that's actually in the plan as a community benefit and I think the plan that you're referring to is just an aerial showing the lots. It's yes, I can confirm that it is in there. It's in the development community benefits linking lot 111 to go to, here it is, Sedan Street to Catherine Street connection, provide an additional connection between Sedan Street and Catherine Street as an exchange for additional building height.
Thank you, Councillor Rowe. Councillor McMullen.
I've just got a question about the officer comment at page 26 of the agenda, where it says that the requirement for demolition of a small portion of the building may weaken the city's case for retention of the buildings in potential future proceedings. I'm just trying to refresh my mind as to how we reach that position. Is that an assessment, or is that a matter of professional opinion that a heritage architect needs to comment on, and is that how we got there? Have we received heritage advice from a heritage architect to that effect?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, that was in discussion with the city's legal representatives.
Okay, well, I won't discuss the legal advice in this forum, but have we had any professional heritage advice on whether the demolition of a small portion of the building could weaken the city's case for retention of the whole lot? Where are we getting that assessment from? Because it's not really a legal one.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, we did actually have an additional heritage assessment included in the LDP, so that actually came from, I think it was from Griffiths Architects who provided that advice. Essentially, one of the city's key arguments which held up was the continuity of the 424 to 428 premises. That was considered one of many reasons for retaining the heritage. So in receiving additional heritage assessment, that's where we provide that officer comment from. I think it's attachment 6 to the item.
Okay, so last question, I'll have a read of that myself, but is the advice essentially that someone like Sanua may uncover a consultant somewhere who'll argue otherwise, but we're pretty comfortable that that the demolition of a small portion is not going to sacrifice the heritage value of the remaining shops?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, yes, applicants may have consultants who disagree with the city's heritage expertise. We do think that this provision may have a small risk on the city's argument in the continuity of the shops, but we feel that there's other heritage assessments and value attached to the shops that still provide a strong argument.
Any more questions on this item? I have one question following on from the Griffith assessment. It seemed to me that the Griffith assessment was analysing it in terms of a bigger picture of the heritage precinct and whether it had any impact on our heritage buildings such as the Subiaco Hotel and the Regal Theatre. But when it actually came to this particular building, there did, and by all means correct me if I'm wrong, but there didn't seem to be any consideration of the complete break of symmetry to the, do you call it the parapet above, which is so well balanced by its design. And if you take out that end shop, it totally destroys that symmetry and balance. And I'd like to know why they didn't assess that. I couldn't see it. And the other two, they did not seem to pick up this significance that this may be the only or one of very few remaining row of 7 single-storey shops that are very representative of the period. They didn't seem to address that issue, that if you took one shop away, it's no longer going to be that significant row of 7 shops. It's only going to be the 6. So I felt they hadn't given enough attention to those very unique features of 424 to 436. Over to you, thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. So the heritage impact statement was prepared to understand the impact of what the built form and development controls are proposed in the LDP. So it doesn't actually go into the really fine scale detail that the heritage assessment provides. In saying that, it's prepared using a standard template and terminology, and it looks at the statement of significance. So I guess the heritage architect has provided their professional advice. It's, you know, if the council disagrees with that, it's up for the council to disagree in that regard. I can't comment any further on their report.
Thank you, because I found it quite an interesting report where they are actually talking to the LDP and what they considered their significance, that the attributes of the LDP. But I really felt because we were asking for a heritage point of view on the building and the precincts, and then they didn't seem to burrow down to that detail. I just wondered whether the report was complete.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, the way that the heritage documents are set out is that you do a heritage assessment and then you do a heritage impact statement. So they're two different documents. The first one details the heritage value of a place, and the other one considers what the impact is of a proposal to that heritage assessment. So you have to read them together rather than one report doing it all, because they are separate as per the heritage guidelines. So I can understand that you may feel that one report doesn't cover everything, but its purpose is not to cover the heritage or redo the heritage assessment.
Thank you. So what did you ask for from Griffiths? Were they asked to do an impact or an assessment report?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, they were asked to undertake a heritage impact statement, as is the appropriate heritage document to prepare with the impacts of the controls in the LDP. There was no need to conduct a heritage assessment because that has already been done in the previous DAs and the heritage consideration of the area. So they didn't really need to revisit that. They just needed to understand what the proposed built form controls might have an impact to those properties.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, we will move to C4, the Draft Local Planning Policy 5.1, Car Parking and Transport. Are there any questions on this item? Apologies, I didn't wait till you'd re-entered the room, Councillor Hammersley. We've moved on to C4, which is the Draft Local Planning Policy 5.1. Do we have any questions on this item? If we don't, we'll move on to C5 and the Draft Amended Local Planning Policy 7.3. Do we have any questions on this item? Okay. Okay, we're moving along well here. We will move on to C6, Draft Local Planning Policy 8.3. It's about public art and public realm. Do we have any questions on this item? Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Thank you. A bit of a slowdown. In regard to the policy, it's for provision of public art. It's for buildings or developments worth over 2 million, and it's 1%. Can you tell me how those figures were arrived at, why it was $2 million and why it was 1%? Has that been discussed with industry bodies? How do they feel about it? And probably the subsequent question is, how does this compare to what other local authorities are doing? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. Percent for public art has been something that has been essentially as a standard implemented in the planning system as of late. So 1% is provided by many local governments, and it's linked to the city's own governance policy, where it provides 1% for public art. So it is very, very consistent with what other local governments are doing in the public art space. What this policy is innovative in is considering public realm and the setting up of a reserve which would assist in maintaining and upkeeping any public realm improvements that might be in an area. That's not something that I've seen in too many other local governments, but it provides a good balance between public art, which is of very big interest to big parts of the community, and the functional assets of public ground design and assets in public infrastructure.
Just very briefly, how was the $2 million figure derived?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, that relates to opt-in applications for development assessment panel developments.
Thank you, Councillor Hammersley.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just a little bit curious about where this comes from in terms of state policy, because I can anticipate a bit of criticism from the development industry. And so I was just wondering where it comes from at that higher level, and is it something that would be a surprise or not a surprise to the developers? Thank you.
Thank you, and through your presiding member. Currently, it's a surprise to applicants and developers in Subiaco that they don't need to provide the contribution. So we are just cottoning on. We're a little bit late in this regard, but the review of the scheme and strategy provided a good time to do it. Some developers have been doing it in any event through their development applications, but this will just provide the city with more statutory weight to require it. So as we understand, it's very common in the development industry and in other local governments.
Any more questions on this item? Just relevant to that, and Councillor Rowan, I'd remember the contributions used to come in lieu of parking, and we seem to dump all that, and so you're suggesting we've had a bit of a gap there ever since, where we actually haven't had contributions.
Thank you, and through presiding member, their separate cash in lieu contributions for car parking are separate scheme requirements. So we've got that in our scheme as well, but state legislation has recently changed the way that works and how that's applicable. So where there's a shortfall of 10 or less, it can't be applied in any event. So public art and cash in lieu for car parking are two separate things.
Thank you, Councillor Rowe.
Yeah, that was always a very interesting one, and spent half of my life trying to bat for that one and for nothing. I don't think we've ever received any money, have we? Cash in lieu for parking. Yeah, that wasn't a question. My question is, looking for holes in this next program, I know a few developers who have done fairly big developments, and they've offered to do their own public art. Now, this is incorporated in this. I'm just going to say, most of them I think you'll find to be the same story. You won't get any cash. They'll all want to do it themselves, and there's a good reason for that. And that's because they can do it cheaper. Now, I'm just wondering if we've got any anything in mind to actually try and value what their contribution would be if they opt to build it into the development.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. So that's all set out in the policy to encourage cash in lieu. A 15% discount to the requirement is provided so that the city can do it, and we've built in some things in the policy to ensure that if it is going to be provided on their site, it does need to interact with the public realm in some manner or form. Now, art can be, and how we get to the valuation, I think that's based on the information provided by the developer, so they would need to provide a schedule of the artwork, its costs, and associated, and we will review that through clearing a planning condition, for example. So we would need to see all relevant material, costing, and so forth. Much of that information is also guided by the city's public art strategy that we have endorsed not too long ago.
Okay, thank you, councillors. If we're finished on that item, we'll move on to C7, which is awarding tender coordination of the Sunset at Subiaco concert series. Do I have any questions on this item? Councillor Hammersley.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. The questions really arise because this, I think, is the first time this has come across this council's desk as something that we need to understand and consider. So I'm just wondering what if we could just have described in brief what the coordinator actually does in terms of running these events.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. The coordinator coordinates all aspects of the event, so they're in charge of selecting the programming, so liaising with the artists, theming the events. They work on the promotional material and the marketing, and then all the relevant approvals that they need for park bookings and sound and things like that on site with support from city officers. So they're managing the event in its entirety.
So I gather from that that the city staff do provide some backup, but pretty much the whole thing is outsourced. Is that right?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, yes, that's correct.
Thank you, Councillor Bell.
Yes, just very briefly. Do we know how many events there are going to be? Look, just we know how many, because I think it's around about $120,000. How many concerts do we get per year?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. We provide 6 concerts over the summer, so we start with a Christmas concert before Christmas with Santa, and it's a big positive family concert, and then we go throughout the summer months, finishing in about February, I think.
Okay, thank you, councillors. If we have no more questions on that item, we'll move to C8, the King Edward Memorial Hospital parking report. Do I have any questions on this item? If so, you can all ask Councillor McMullen, who was on the ABC radio this morning, answering all sorts of questions. Yes, do we have any questions on this item? Thank you.
Through you, presiding member. This is a question regarding the Stubbs Terrace parking suggestions that they be both provided to staff at a capped rate of $3 per day, I think is the suggestion, and also for the overflow parking for families. I found the report to be just astonishingly good, and congratulations to our Manager for Health and Compliance, Nathan Russell, for preparing it. What I was interested is that the report did point to that there were shortfalls in the distribution process for the existing permits, and that sometimes permits weren't being given, and there were days when only 7 permits were given. So this begs the question, do we need to give an additional 20, or is that going to be a fluid situation where we first look at how many might be needed and offer those, and then do another assessment? I mean, I am concerned because I live in Daglish, and I too experience congestion in the street I live in, and get reports from local residents who speak to me about cars regularly blocking their access ways and parking on the street. Perhaps this is where the issue comes from. Obviously it's not the NICU parents who are doing it, but I am concerned that if we don't have a process which protects residents, we'll have the issue that perhaps has happened around King Edward Memorial being transferred somewhere else. I'm all for supporting this. I think it's fantastic, and every piece of suggestion there is a result of a thorough investigation, but I just wanted to query that. Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. The recommendations as they currently stand are not to actually increase the number of permits that we allocate, so that would still stay at 20 per week. The idea behind the establishment of the overflow area on on Stubbs south of the Daglish train station is to address some of the feedback that we received while preparing this report, and that is that what was most important to these parents and what relieved the stress, or some of the stress that they were feeling, was that they could source available all-day free parking. Feedback suggests that one of the reasons potentially for the low usage of the permits and the low numbers that are generally observed in the area is that, as we've suggested previously, the parking pressure in the area, particularly where the permits are valid, is very high. So even if families are lucky enough to be able to get a permit from the hospital, they're not able to use the permit. They drive around for a while and then they seek parking elsewhere in a paid car station, or they're taking their chances. So as part of our investigations, we discovered that Stubbs South was very underutilised on that side of the road, and we thought it prudent to offer that area to relieve that stress from parents. Now, that recommendation is subject to, we've suggested it should be reviewed next year when we review the parking precinct plans, and that'll be the parking precinct plans throughout the city, so it'll be all of the areas that are impacted by the hospital parking.
Do I have any more questions? Thank you, Councillor Hammersley.
Yeah, thank you. Just looking at the recommendation 2, which does look attractive. One of the things we find about parking in Subiaco is that compliance is always an issue. So I was just wondering whether the new technologies that were being proposed, the e-permit systems, were going to provide some sort of opportunity for people who would be eligible to park in this area to actually display something so that we know that it is actually being used by proper people, because it's going to be very difficult for the city to be patrolling in that area, which is a very busy and high turnover area. So I was just wondering, is there a compliance plan?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. You're very correct. Compliance is difficult in this area. We are active in this area with the rangers on a very regular basis. The suggestion to include the introduction of e-permits isn't necessarily aimed to improve compliance. It's aimed to create a more flexible permit system that is more usable for those that need it. It will offer us an improved data collection for how often permits are used and potentially where they're being used, but that doesn't necessarily make up a part of our compliance action. We are regularly and always reviewing the compliance action that we undertake across the city, and certainly in this area we would continue to do so. We haven't investigated in depth how our compliance action may look going forward. That would be something that we would develop over time as we implement these recommendations and make the adjustments as they're required.
A question on a similar theme, because I think really what we do want to achieve is what was earlier described as an opportunity for the people who have those special needs to find a parking spot. You know, having a permit's not great if you can't find a parking spot. So that's why I'm attracted to this, but I'd really like to see us being able to find a solution to make sure that if those spots, if we do provide those spots, whether a deal is or isn't done about car park number 5, but that they are there actually available for hospital visitors. And I know it's a little bit complicated because it's not just the NICU hospital visitors, so I'm not sure if we could just think a bit more about that. And then that brings me on to the number 5, which is the Stubbs Terrace, which is also a very good idea. But again, would you be anticipating that area be only be signed in a way that would mean that if you don't have one of those NICU E-permits, when they become the E-permits, you will not be able to park in that area? Is that what's contemplated?
Thank you, Presiding Member, and through you. Look, that is certainly an option. We can make an area of Stubbs Terrace South as authorised vehicles permit only. One of the other options is to simply make that street one of the valid streets where the permits can be used. It is a fairly long section of road and there is a lot of parking available there and it's very underutilised. So at the moment, just honouring permits on that section of the road will essentially guarantee parking. If that situation were to change, we can allocate part of that street for permit use only.
Just, can you remind me, it's probably buried, there's a lot of information in here, so how many parking spots are there down there? Do we know? At the hospital? No, on the south of Daglish train station in that strip.
Bear in mind it's very important for commuters, people catch the train down there too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Member, and through you. The section of Stubbs that we're looking at here would have 70 to 80 parking bays available. The occupancy, once you move south of the Daglish train station, falls away very, very quickly. And the section we look at, average occupancy probably sits at about 10 to 8 at any given time. So there is a lot of parking available south of the train station.
So we could contemplate perhaps giving some exclusive parking in that area and then leaving some for public as well. You know, so if you've got 60 or 70, because I'm just getting conscious of, we're always told by planners that people, 800 metres is the magic number that people will walk, but clearly we've been told by the hospital that 800 metres is not the magic number. People will not walk 800 metres. So I'm just trying to think about how we're going to deliver some parking that is certain and at least a reasonable work. And so if we're talking that this parking starts at 800 metres, you don't want to have to go another 600 metres down the road. And so I'm just wondering if we can think about whether there's a spot that we can give certainty.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. Look, part of the recommendation number 5 is to look at this as part of the review of the parking precinct plans. Now, those plans look at the parking by precinct in a very holistic way, and I think that one of the things we would certainly look at doing is, as we implement the recommendations of this report, to continue with our regular occupancy surveys and our data gathering over longer than the period that we've had for the preparation of this report, and then feed that data into the review of the parking precinct plans. What may come out of that, there's many different options for parking schemes, timed, whatever it may be. We would certainly be looking at as many alternatives as we could come up with for a way to best accommodate and best utilise what is a very underutilised parking resource, which is fairly rare in Subiaco.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. This I suppose, leads on from Councillor Hammersley's questions, because I think I did not think I was confused, but now I am. We're saying no extra permits, but then we're contemplating with e-permits that we're going to let some, if the NICU parents with the existing permits, the hard permits that we issue, are going to be able to park in that overflow area on Stubbs Terrace. And, you know, I was understanding that we're actually going to allow more parents to park in the Stubbs Terrace area. So that's the first question: is that actually the case? And that would be done through issuing e-permits, not the you know, the existing early bird permit system or the hard copy or whatever it is that the hospitals issues now. So can you just clarify all that, because I'm afraid I am somewhat confused. Thanks.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. The current proposal is not to change the number of early bird permits that are issued. So they can issue up to 20 per week now, and that won't change. What will change is that the hard copy system that's currently used, we're proposing to implement an e-permit system. So what we are hoping to achieve out of that is to increase the flexibility in the way that these permits can be used. As it stands now, with the hard copy system, once that permit is used and issued to a family, it can only be used by that family. Now, regardless of whether or not they're in the hospital for 4 hours on that particular day, or 2 hours, or 8 hours, whatever it happens to be, no one can use it when they're not on site. So the idea of an e-permit system is that as they were to leave the hospital, they would check that permit back in, and it's now available for another family to use.
So I take it from that we're not actually going to allow more than 20 cars or vehicles or families at any one time have access to this parking. Is that correct? Because that was my understanding, this overflow parking was going to provide more parking than the 20 vehicles that are currently accommodated by the current permit. Could you clarify? Thanks.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. The idea is that there would be no more than 20 vehicles at any one time. However, over a day, there could be more than 20 vehicles that are using any of these permits. The idea of the overflow parking is not to increase the number of permits that are being issued or anything like that. It is to create an area where there is available parking for early bird permit holders. As I think I've mentioned earlier, that some of the feedback we received is that there is no parking available for them. So even though they're able to get an early bird permit, they're not able to use it because they can't find a place to park. So the provision of Stubbs South is to provide a location where they will be able to find a location to park.
Oh, sorry. Through you, Presiding Member. Just from my understanding and reading the report is that the outcome that was achieved in this report was through a consultative process with the Helping Hands and Tiny Sparks, and with King Edward Memorial Hospital and various stakeholders. So my understanding is that this outcome is one that is satisfactory to all parties, and that the outcome of being able to use those parking bays, which will give those families hitherto who haven't been able to access parking, they'll get the parking that they need. And then at some point in the future, there could be a reassessment, because when we see all 20 e-parking bays being used, we'll know that they're being utilised, and then there can be further discussion. Is that correct? Is that a good assessment?
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member, yes, that is correct.
Well, this might be something for down the track. As we say, this won't be the last time this comes to us, and I'm pleased to hear that. But I'm just wondering whether we thought about having two-tiered system, and that is an early bird parking permit that works for the original area, for the really critical people who are in that first critical stage, and then something slightly, a second-tier version for people to go and park down on stubs, because I think anyone who has witnessed a family go through this knows that there is a period where it's incredibly critical, but you then spend a very long time at that hospital. Most babies are there for 3 months at least, sometimes longer. So the requirement to be there is still there, but you're not in that acute stage for the whole of the period. So you can see that parking close to the hospital is really important for people in that first stage. And of course it would be desirable for everyone, but it's a little bit more practical to have to walk 800 metres if you're in that later phase. So maybe that's something we could talk to the stakeholders about as this thing goes forward, and I just wondered if that had been thought about.
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. Yes, one of the outcomes that we've sort of tried to achieve through recommendation 2, specifically with the request to the Metropolitan Access and Parking Department and the hospital itself to allocate car park 5 from its current use as staff parking to use for NICU families, is to provide them with that on-site available parking. Now, how the hospital chose to administer this permit program and issue these permits is largely up to the hospital. We would certainly be very keen to provide advice and to speak to them about it, but ultimately it is the hospital that issues the permits. We would simply be providing or facilitating the technology or the hard copy permits as required.
Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. Has the Health Department come any way in providing more visitor parking on its own site, considering that is its obligation?
Thank you, and through you, Presiding Member. No, there is no additional, been no additional patient or visitor parking provided on site. So there is the single car station that makes, I think it's 29 bays that are available out of the 480 some odd that are on site. So those are the only patient and visitors parking made available on the hospital campus. So if I could clarify then with point 2 of the recommendation, what it's saying is that we'll give the hospital Hensman car station for staff parking. In return, the hospital will then provide parking on its site for patients.
which is what it's supposed to do anyway.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. We are seeking to get the hospital to provide Car Park 5, which is on their campus for NICU families. The Hensman Road car station, we're not proposing to give that to the hospital for their staff parking. We're proposing to attempt to designate that as visitors and patient parking. It will remain a city-paid car station. We would be looking to the hospital to assist us to make sure that their staff did not park in that area so that it was available more readily by patients and visitors.
Councillor McMullen, thank you.
Just a follow-up question in relation to Car Park 5. Has the person you're dealing with explained why it is they've taken the position of not wanting to allocate Car Park 5 to the NICU families? Why is it that they want to allocate it for staff parking? Is there a particular reason for that?
Thank you, presiding member, and through you. No, we haven't really received much by way of explanation for the way that car parking on the campus is allocated. Car Park 5 was previously used by hospital volunteers, and it was identified by one of the hospital directors as usually being empty and underutilised, and that it was a potential option that could be used. When we raised that as an option with the Metropolitan Access and Parking Department, we were informed that over the coming months it was to be transferred to staff parking, and in fact it has since been transferred to staff parking.
Just one more question. Have they indicated where the volunteers are going to park?
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, no, they haven't. We haven't received any feedback from MAPD at this stage.
Thank you. I have a question about this. I've been walking this area and observing various times of the day and on the weekend that the car park isn't full. This is the King Edward car park, particularly, say, a Saturday and so on. Admittedly, there might be various times in which there's a change of shift and so on. But certainly on a Saturday for the city of Subiaco, we have a lot of cars that are coming in. They're coming in for the markets, for shopping and so on. And plus we perhaps have more residents at home with their cars in front. So we are very tight in this area on a Saturday for parking. And I just wondered if there was any flexibility in King Edward to think about various days like a Saturday where they would actually open up. It seemed to me that was a day that they could take all the NICU and patient parking because it just didn't seem to be very full. Have we had any sort of look at in sort of breaking up the days and use? Thank you.
Thank you, presiding member, and through you. We have spoken to the Metropolitan Access and Parking Department about the usage of their on-site car parks. They have indicated that they would not be prepared to make them available as they're reserved for sort of the afternoon and the night shift hospital staff, and their concern is that if they're made available to the public or to visitors and patients, that those spots wouldn't be vacated in time for the hospital staff to arrive to start their shift. One thing to note about the parking restrictions all through this area on a weekend, the on-street and car stations, is there are no time restrictions in place. So anyone can park on the street or in a city car station of a weekend, and there is no time restriction, and the car stations themselves are free of charge.
If I can just finish my question, I just suspect that, for example, on the weekend, there are a lot of the ancillary services, perhaps the social workers, the physios or whatever, who are not there, that would be there during the week. And that's why it's obviously free, but their car parks obviously a lot emptier, but you're saying at this stage you're just not entertaining that idea at all. Okay, thank you. Councillor Jennings, thank you.
Thank you, through you, presiding member. It's my understanding that at Perth Children's Hospital there's a concessional parking arrangement that the health service there, or the hospital and the government, provides to patients and their families, where they can get a $5 a day subsidised parking. So they can park on site, and I guess the government pays the parking operator there the rest of the fee. And there's some, qualifications for that. But have you had any discussions with King Eddie's administration as to why there's not a similar scheme being set up with the City of Subiaco, whereby NICU parents could get a subsidised parking paid by the hospital, the government, and in the City of Subiaco parking stations, for example, and then the city is subsidised for the balance of the parking fee that might be payable for the day, or however long the people are there. So has that ever been discussed with the hospital? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. No, it hasn't. I think it's important to note that the department's own parking and access strategy does sort of does say that they should be prioritising patients and visitors unless they have entered suitable long-term agreements with the surrounding local authorities. So at no point has Metropolitan Access and Parking Department or King Edward Memorial Hospital approached the city, certainly not any time recently, to have that discussion. I think it is important to note that the parking availability at the Perth Children's Hospital, being a sort of an access-controlled multi-storey car park versus what's available on site at King Edward's and in the surrounding city car stations, it is a slightly different arrangement. So a similar sort of simple subsidy like that may not be possible, but as we haven't been approached with them and as we haven't received a huge amount of engagement from them, that hasn't been discussed with them in any detail.
And this is back to the Stubbs Terrace parking area. And in the report it says there's 50 to 60 bays and there's 8 to 12 vehicles occupying those bays during the day. So even if all the NICU parents who have those existing early bird permits parked in that area, it would leave like maybe up to another 20 bays that are available. So what would be the problem with offering, even if it's an extra 10 bays, by way of some kind of permit system which only allows parking in that area, just to supplement, for the parking needs of the NICU parents? What would be wrong with doing that, given that presumably it can always be reviewed? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member. Look, at the moment, with the short period that we've been able to collect the data for, we're just not sure of the entire picture. We don't know why all 20 permits are not being issued every week. We don't know why we're not seeing much higher usage out on the streets. We don't know whether or not it's simply because there's no parking available, or if there's some other reason. So one of the things that we are hoping to be able to do by providing a mostly guaranteed location for them to park, and through the implementation of the e-permit system, is that we'll be able to collect much better data that we will then be able to use to give us a much more complete picture about how these are being used, when these permits are being used, and then we can make adjustments to provide as much as we can, given the limitations in the area to these parents.
I have one more question. On the radio this morning, the representative from the King Edward Memorial Hospital talked in terms of 8 to 10 years before that hospital moves, and that was perhaps a more realistic shift than the 5 years that's been proposed, from my understanding. So I wondered if you got any concept when you were talking to King Edward, whether they are actually now accommodating to a more of a longer term position of dealing with this parking problem, because I sense there was a bit of an excuse that the hospital's moving soon, so we'll just make do perhaps. So yeah, have you had any of that sort of conversation? Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, presiding member, staff did. When speaking to one of the hospital directors, discussed that. The date that was provided at that point was 2029. So I believe they are working to a medium to long-term sort of timeline, but we haven't received any sort of formal advice around that.
Thank you, councillors. Yes, Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, and through you, presiding member. This is just a general question. Has consideration been given to whether a general media statement should be released after the next council meeting, whatever the result of the deliberations on the officer's recommendations, containing information that is in the officer's report, to alleviate some of the misinformation which has been out in the community about this situation. Thank you.
That might be a question for our new CEO.
Help the new CEO out of that one, and also give the two managers a bit of a break, because I think between them they've been talking for about an hour and a half. So a different voice for a change. Most certainly, councillor, the city will well and truly prepare a media release for release on Wednesday morning after the council meeting. No question about that. In fact, it will probably be prepared beforehand, or a couple of versions, and either one will be modified first thing in the morning, because I suspect we will be hounded by the media very early on Wednesday morning for a response.
Thank you, councillors. Moving on to C9, Draft Rockaby Road South Streetscape Master Plan. I just also want to ask some councillors, how are you going? Does anybody need a comfort stop? No, we'll keep going. Okay. Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you, through you, presiding officer. Just a couple of quick questions. One is in regard to page 60. It's about the turning lanes, and the comment at the bottom of point 4, essentially. Nicholson Road intersection is the long-term aspect of the master plan, and final modifications will be based upon more detailed traffic modelling. It would appear to me that that Nicholson Rockaby Road is quite an essential ingredient to the master plan. So when can we expect to see something for the for that intersection? Thank you.
Thank you, and for you, presiding member. So, at this stage, the Nicholson Road portion, which is actually part of the longer term as far as the staging program goes, it's currently unfunded. So, when that time frame is, I guess, determined, that would be the ideal time to undertake the traffic analysis. Essentially, what I'm saying is, it might not be worth undertaking the traffic analysis now, if indeed the works happen a few years from now, when obviously the traffic since changed, and we'll be compelled to do it anyway by main roads, subject to make any change, or as a condition to make any changes anyway.
Thank you. Do I have any more questions on this item? Thank you, Councillor Powell.
Yes, thank you. There was just one other. It was in regard again to this is on page 63. That the city's allocated 1.1 152 for the local improvements to Rockaby Road South. The first stages are budgeted for. How much the city will need to include, consider its, the inclusion in the future in the master plan, the capital works program. How much more are we looking at spending on that master plan, if that's just the first 3 stages?
Thank you, and for you, presiding member. So the remaining to do the 4 blocks with the long-term upgrades, it's in the order of about $3 million.
Thank you, Councillor Rowe.
Thank you, presiding member. Yeah, just a couple of things here. I was worried about the slip lane in Nicholson, I think, leading out of town. I think that's pretty academic to leave that pretty much the same in regard to maintaining that slip lane. But the other thing too is we sort of don't seem to come down to Bagot, and we sort of stop short. But what would be wrong with incorporating some a tree in front of the garage on that side? It's sort of the garage is pretty ordinary, the view of it, and I would have thought that an established tree, putting in an established plane tree or whatever, would actually soften that whole approach. We seem to have stopped just short of that. The other thing I wanted to ask was, while you're talking, is how many car bays, looking through the complaints, how many car bays are we losing, please?
The car bay, for you, presiding member, so the car-based question is fairly straightforward, so there's no intended change to the number of car bays. So what's there existing will stay, and as is noted there, because there was one of the raised as one of the concerns for the feedback, what we've tried to make clear is the only gaps in parking are the existing ones, which we just formalise and put better form crossings. As to your question around trees, there are limited locations to put trees along Rockaby. There are a few that have been flagged, and they'll be subject to investigation as part of the detailed design, and that would probably be one of the locations. So it would be, it's intended, but until that detailed design is done, I can't say for sure whether we could get established tree there.
Any more questions on this item? Okay, thank you. We'll move along to C10, proposed road names for 133 Salvado Road subdivision. Are there any questions on this item? Okay, thank you. Moving on to C11, awarding of tender A6107 for Rosalie Park LED lighting upgrade. Okay, moving on to C12, awarding of tender A6221 for the Rosalie Park mixed-use sporting facility. Moving on to C13, awarding of tender 61217, provision of parking machine maintenance services and parking machine supply. No. C14, awarding of tender A6138, provision of cleaning service and consumables. Thank you, Councillor Hammersley.
Yeah, this is a fairly easy question, I hope. I may have missed it, but I didn't pick up whether this was a change of contractor. And the reason I asked the question is I've noticed in this one there were 12 responses to the tender, so it was obviously a competitive process. And I just think for transparency, it would be always good if we could make sure that we disclose whether, you know, a current tenderer has been the successful one, and also reassure the public that any biases have been dealt with in the scoring process. I'm sure they have. It's not intended to suggest otherwise. It's a matter of what goes on the public record, so that were anyone to be interested, which probably they're not, but you never know. So I was just wondering, in this particular case, is it the same tenderer? And has anyone ever thought about making our reports just that little bit more transparent? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I can confirm that the preferred respondent is not the incumbent supplier. The incumbent is Burragoon Cleaning.
It's just that question about whether we've thought about whether we should disclose those sorts of facts in these things in both directions, because I think it is just material openness, transparency, and just establishing on the record that that we're onto that stuff.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's something we can look to include as part of our template for tender reports. So we'll take that on notice, and I'll have a chat with my director about that tomorrow.
Any more questions on this item? Okay, moving on to C15, financial statements and reports for the month ending the 30th of June. Do I have any questions on this item? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Council. Before I close the Before I close the meeting tonight, you've probably noticed that we've been very privileged to have two CEOs sitting up here on the bench, as we are actually transferring to the new CEO, being Colin Campbell, my right, and our acting CEO, Cliff Fruing, who officially finished on Friday but is handing over for the week. That makes it actually the last formal meeting for Cliff to attend as the acting CEO, and I felt this was an opportune time to acknowledge the tremendous work that he has done for us over the last 11 months. 11 months which perhaps was a little bit longer than he planned to stay. I'm sure he felt that all he had to do was organise the appointment of a new CEO and he would be out of here. But as you can see, he was quite successful with that, in guiding council with that appointment. But things took a little bit longer and got a little bit more complicated. As you know, Cliff has been with us for 11 months, and in that time it's been really quite an intense period of time. We have passed through major planning policies and our South Rockaby Road local development plan. We had a 3-day SAT hearing with Sanur and the City of Subiaco, which we were very successful in and which Cliff attended. We also had the draft results of the authorised inquiry, and so once again Cliff guided us through that, and both councillors and the administration responded with their submissions. We also had a pretty fast turnaround on that King Edward Memorial Hospital report, which sort of landed in our laps unexpectedly, and we were true to our promise of putting together a very slick and thorough report, once again under Cliff Fruing's reign. So I probably haven't mentioned everything because we also had rain, floods and sinkholes. And he also showed some considerable skill and talent in the media and fronting up on all TV stations, much to my relief. So at all times I've found, and I'm sure fellow councillors would agree, that Cliff has been very available. He's been very useful he's been very professional and always a gentleman. And I thank you very much, Cliff, for your time with Subiaco. You're always welcome to come back and visit us.
I'll wait till some of these reports are forgotten about.
And thank you very much. And if we can just give you applause for... Okay, thank you. And so we move on to agenda item 8 and the closure of the meeting. Thank you. I'm sorry. I understand we're not going into a confidential item. So it is at 7:21 p.m. Thank you.